guess, on policy, and much more than perhaps Queen Elizabeth does. I once was visiting the palace and to talk about Fiji, actually. This was in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And met the Queen and Prince Philip. Had a real feeling for Fiji.
Yeah.
I did my best, but what became clear to me is that the communication between the palace and the Foreign Office was not very good.
That's deteriorated
Almost
over time,
as if one
hasn't it?
did not know what the other was doing.
Really?
Yet somehow the Queen is inevitably in that arena of the relationships between sovereign entities, and she's there.
Yes.
And I got a little worried by that.
I wonder what's caused that, because it wasn't always like that.
It wasn't always like that.
No. And she was extremely well informed.
Right. It also seems to me that more and more Queen Elizabeth are getting more and more like Queen Victoria, in the sense that, as far as I know, Queen Victoria didn't travel very much.
Mm.
You know, basically, she stayed within the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And I guess as time goes on, that's going to be the lot more and more of Queen Elizabeth. Recently, of course, she's paid a visit to Turkey, I know that.
Mm-hmm.
But to come out here to New Zealand, Australia, is going to be more and more of demand upon her. So I think that she's likely to be more located and centred there in UK in good health, and likely to be with us for quite a while yet. But she'll be more and more of the Queen Victoria type, I think.
Yes.
I mean, 80 years old is, you know, getting on, and to make a trip all the way down to this part of the world is a big ask.
You don't travel economy, though.
No.
Well, no, this is true. This is true. But, you know, you kind of get to that sort of stage of your life, and, you want to have a cup of tea and sit in your stateroom.
What is all that going to mean for the rest of the royal family? The Queen's duties will obviously be farmed out amongst others, mostly to Prince Charles.
I think we've been seeing that for some years, the way in which, for instance, the Prince's household has been increasing with more secretaries and so on. Clearly, there's a need, as in any hereditary monarchy, to prepare the next generation.
Mm.
And previously, the Prince's primary focus was on his charitable interests and so on. But in relatively recent years, he has been taking an increasing role in what we might describe as a political.
Is he pre-positioning himself? Some of his pronouncements, I mean, he's a very smart guy. Some of his pronouncements about architecture, about farming, about some other aspects of the economy have been very pointed and seem, to me at least, to be pre-positioning him for some more active role when the time comes.
I suspect the opposite is actually happening. He is aware that as king, his discretion to make these utterances would be less, though he may be inclined to be more outspoken than the Queen has been. But I think that he's aware that as king, he cannot have as much an influence in those fields than he can as Prince of Wales.
I'm talking to Sir Paul Reeves, Noel Cox and Sarah Henry about the Queen and her heirs and successors. Is Prince Charles marketable as a king? Will there be I mean, if it happened, next week, would there be enormous interest or resurgence of interest in him and his consort in particular?
I think initially there would be a little surge because obviously there would be a change. There would be a male in there. How are they going to do things differently? I think it would taper off very quickly. It would not have the same effect as William stepping in there.
Ah. Well, William's not going to step in there, though, is he?
Well, probably not yet. I mean, William is still very young, 25, hasn't done any of the things that, you're meant to do by that sort of age. But there is a lot more interest in William and Harry and their lives than there is for Charles. I mean, Charles has the luxury a little bit of sort of flying under the radar. I mean, he hit the headlines with all the Camilla stuff. But, I mean, people kind of let them get on and do their own thing because they are quite dull. They're not out at this function and that function. They're not, on these fabulous holidays in lovely warm places wearing bikinis and that sort of thing. So...
Well, they're not photographable in such
circumstances.
No,
so I would say in terms of the marketability of Charles, it's not that fabulous glamour that we want from the royal family.
Does this matter?
Well, as the Prince Philip said, we're not celebrities. So they would not see themselves as being that type of women's magazine fodder. they would be more interested if an article were to be written on, for example, the Prince of Wales's ecological campaigns.
I'd like just to concentrate a little bit on, we call it the royal family. And there was an attempt, say, 40 years ago to present this as the ideal family, actually. And they positioned Andrew to relate to Canada, Charles to relate to Australia, and Edward to relate to New Zealand. So they went to schools in those various countries.
Yes.
But that, I don't think, has produced abiding connections. It hasn't done that.
We don't see a lot of Edward, do we?
No, we don't see a lot of Edward. He's doing whatever he wants to do somewhere else. And there's not a particular relationship, although he does have, of course, a relationship to Maori at Putiki there, just outside of Wanganui. And when he comes, that is expressed and he goes there, but that's not very frequently. So they're not obviously a picture of the ideal family, quite the opposite.
Well,
So,
I mean, this is one of the sort of points of attraction, I suppose, for the media. They are, to some extent, a dysfunctional family, the dysfunctionality being rather imposed upon them by circumstance.
Right, well, they express many of the dynamics which other families also have within their midst.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
but the fact is they play that out on the public stage, and that's, I think, a great sadness.
And I think that to describe them as dysfunctional is to make a rather extreme statement. Clearly, for example, royal marriages have not been particularly stable, but then given that they are lived in the public arena, perhaps that's not particularly surprising.
But then that hasn't changed. I mean, 300 years ago they didn't have stable marriages either. It's just that, you know, we didn't know about it, or B, it just wasn't talked about, you know.
You know, the media wasn't anywhere near as intrusive 100 years ago as they are now.
Well, that raises the question: what are the limits, and when will we ever reach limits, or will the media simply intrude further and further into the bedrooms, the kitchens, the bathrooms of the royal family,
I mean,
to the point where there is no privacy at all?
Well, the media get a very hard rap on this kind of stuff, but the media wouldn't do it if there wasn't a demand for it. You've got a worldwide demand from people wanting to know this information.
Well, it's a chicken and egg thing, this,
that's
isn't it? You
right.
give them the pictures, they want more.
Absolutely. So it's very easy to blame the media.
If you took the pictures away and you stopped writing the stories, they'd get over it, wouldn't they? They wouldn't want
not
anymore.
at all. Not at all.
Huh?
It would create more
They wouldn't buy the
fascination.
magazine, that's true.
There would be more fascination because there would be no information out there. So, you know, people would be going to other extremes to get that sort of thing. So, well, I mean, the media are delivering what the public want.
We need a balance, that's all. I don't think you can say that the media should be excluded in any way. I don't think that's feasible at all.
And also the idea that there's something called the public and needs to be talked about too. You know, who are we talking about here? Obviously not talking about me, but I'm just one person. I guess that there will continue to be a royal family. There will continue to be a monarch. There will continue to be things that they do which will interest the people who want to report those things. And on we go. Where the boundaries are, that changes all the time, I think.
Does it?
Oh, well,
I think they seem to be encroaching more and more, don't they?
Well, they may be encroaching, but I think on the other side, the world is pushing to get more and more into, as you say, the bathrooms, the bedrooms, and any other room, actually.
Yeah.
And how far do you go? Well, I don't know.
But nobody knows, and the media certainly doesn't know. I mean, the Diana, the catastrophe that occurred, it was a direct result of that.
Well, Diana
And we should have learned
played
a
the
lesson.
media, though. I mean, she was the master at how to manipulate the media. She would turn it on one day and she would turn it off the next day. She very much knew what she was doing, and she enjoyed the majority of the attention that she
Is
received.
Kate Middleton going to fill the gap? Is she the new Diana? Somebody like I think you've said this, haven't you?
Absolutely. I mean, she is the closest thing to Diana that we've had.
Well,
Up
poor
to this
girl, poor
point.
girl, that's all I can say.
Yes.
What a fate.
Well, I
Exactly.
mean, that's something that she has to think about if you
Yeah,
if
but
you
don't-
get
she's thinking
involved
about
You
with
don't
that.
need to pin the label on it, though,
No, it's but
Well, it's
that's
inevitable.
going to happen.
It's
isn't it?
inevitable.
especially if you do it.
Well, that's
Well,
right.
everybody's
Chicken and
doing
egg.
it.
I'm not doing
It's
it.
not just me
I'm not
personally
doing
doing
it.
it.
No,
I don't know that.
I'm guilty of asking the question about it. That's bad enough. Let's look at the reserve powers of the Queen. Paul, they're not widely understood, and they are very interesting in their ambiguity. We haven't had any difficulty with these, but other countries, notably Australia, to some extent have. Are the reserve powers okay as they are?
Well, my approach always was to seek the best legal advice. And for me, I had the Solicitor General, who was very able and very willing to stand alongside of me. I also find that at the centre of constitutions there's a grey area where there's bluff, and you push, and you say to people, dare ya. And there's a bit of that stuff right in the middle of constitutions, I think.
Yeah.
But if you go back to some of the classical books and tell you that under the English Constitution, the monarch has the ability to warn, to delay, and to seek advice. I don't know whether that still stands up, but those are the sorts of things, the criteria that were there. I know, too, that she is in constant touch with her Prime Minister. He comes to see, or he or she, comes to see the Queen on a regular basis, and I think that's really good.
Yeah.
I don't know myself of any occasions when the Queen has had to say, hey, don't ask me to sign that piece of legislation to law because I believe it's wrong and it goes against everything I stand for, and if you push me, I will abdicate. I don't think it's ever quite got to that point.
Because of the distance, the daylight now between the operations of government. You were talking before the lack of information with the Foreign Office.
Yes.
Seems to be across the board, from what I understand.
Right.
So that the monarch
Right.
is now once removed very
Okay.
clearly from...
I don't know what Noel's got to say about this.
No, well, I think the situation in the United Kingdom is slightly different because the Queen's audiences with the Prime Minister, or rather the Prime Minister's audience with the Queen, I think is
Interesting
important.
slip.
Yes, sorry. I think it's important because there are no direct reports on what is actually discussed, and
No.
they're quite lengthy discussions, and it's clear from anecdotal evidence that quite important political matters are discussed. So I think it would be at that point you would resolve any potential question of the Queen not being inclined to sign a bill. After all, it's been 400 years since a monarch refused to sign a bill, and even then it was Queen Anne that was on the advice of the government that she refused to sign a bill. Now, I think the important issue for us is how does this work in New Zealand? Because if we see the Governor-General as being the Queen's representative here, carrying out analogous functions, is it working as well in this country, given that the Governor-General does not regularly see the Prime Minister? I think the channels of communication could be opened a bit wider there.
You think?
I think so.
Drawing a little closer?
During
in that
my
respect?
time, I had 4 Prime Ministers. So
All very different, too.
David
Yes.
Longy, Geoffrey Palmer, Mike Moore for a short time, and then at the very end, Jim Bolger. But David Longy asked me to be the Governor-General, but I afterwards had a little sense of being left alone, actually, and felt that, in fact, I needed to come into the loop more or be taken seriously.
Yeah.
The other thing that a Governor-General, I used to write to the Queen and express my opinion about this and that going on in the country.
Yes.
And I wouldn't get a direct reply from her, but I always get a long, lengthy reply from her private secretary,
Yes.
which I just
Queen, thank you
anticipated
very much. for
was
your- yeah.
expressing her viewpoint. Now, I'm sure those letters are not discoverable now, but so
Well,
I
it will
kept
be one
in touch.
day, surely. Or no, perhaps not.
I don't know.
Perhaps
I
not.
think those sorts of communications should be kept secret for as long as possible, if not indefinitely, because they relate to the inner workings of the highest levels of government. And I think if you expose those to potential public airing, you actually damage the freedom of expression, which is very
yeah.
important.
Yes, these are delicate
Yeah, they are very
issues.
delicate. Yes.
If the Queen were to die, she will at some point, this will trigger a Republican sentiment. Inevitably, change will invoke change. And I have to say, I am of that persuasion. I believe that we should move, but I don't believe we should move until that point. I once had a conversation with Prince Charles about this, and he thought that was a pretty good idea. So I'm convinced, but a lot of people aren't convinced, and Noel, you're not convinced.
No, just because the Queen dies, as she will inevitably at some point, does not mean that we have to move to republic. Because I think you have to remember that, firstly, there'd be the excitement of a new reign, and whatever people might think of Prince Charles at the moment, I think generally speaking, he's regarded as being a very earnest man, and his views may not necessarily accord with everyone's ideas, But he has been very much in the forefront in a number of areas. For example, his conservation ideas.
Oh yeah,
were
no,
very
he's a lot to offer.
So I think the point would be...
But he can still offer that, regardless of the status of his relationship with New Zealand.
Yes, but I think the important point here is that on the Queen's death, he automatically becomes King of New Zealand.
Yes.
And if we were then to say, well, it's time to become a republic, that's a direct slap in the face for Prince Charles. More importantly, at a time of that sort of change, is it the appropriate time for New Zealand to consider a change, which effectively is a significant change in a constitutional setup? I think that sort of change is one that should be taken very cautiously and not rushed just because somebody's died.
I think emotion will
Can I say, Chris, that I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool or wedded to monarchy. Hang loose on that and just see the way in which people want to go. But I would say for Māori, to personalise the Queen, or personalise the Crown, to put a face on it, in fact, is very, very important. Now, Fiji, which is a republic, but go there now, and pictures of the Queen and Prince Philip are all over the place. And they observe not simply the Queen's birthday, they observe Prince Charles's birthday, actually, because he was there when Fiji became independent.
That's right, he was too.
So you can't set to one side too easily the idea that the Crown should have a human representation, because you're talking here about relationships between entities and people.
Sentiment, which is very strong. Sarah, would you welcome King Charles III?
Well, I wouldn't have any choice if he did step in there. I mean, I would much rather see William in that position. I think for the average everyday New Zealander, they forget what having a monarchy actually is. I mean, to the average everyday New Zealander, they are people who live in a palace, who live their lives. They forget that they're part of the actual constitution of the country.
Let me turn the question around a bit. Could you sell more magazines if the Queen was no longer Queen of New Zealand? Would it make a difference?
Don't think so, no.
Yes, very interesting. And thanks to my guests, former Governor-General Sir Paul Reeves, Women's Day editor Sarah Henry, and Chairman of the Monarchist League, Noel Cox.